Someone at the National Security Agency could blatantly be paid a fee, created briefs to basically mean any shady people are safe and free to take a peek. Look, I don't believe in evil, but I believe in greed or paranoia. Power hungry, that's abusive. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and I'll hammer that home till they have to shoot me. I'll be happy to head down the bookies and bet that they're getting a good look at my cookies. They're up all night to get cookies.
Hello, and welcome to the Tech Dirt Podcast. I'm Mike Masnick. Last week, we had McGill professor Gabriella Coleman on the show to talk about her wonderful new book, Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy. We discussed Anonymous and its shift from pure trolling into activism, and we're not done yet because Gabriella is back again this week to discuss a different part of the book, talking more about things like the Snowden revelations, the level of surveillance that was revealed, and how those revelations may actually be a reason for some optimism. Once again, we'll start off with Gabriella reading a bit from her book, and that will lead into a discussion with myself and Dennis Yang. So take it away.
Will we, with the help of people like Edward Snowden, the ex-NSA contractor who bore enormous risk in speaking out, manage to compel our governments to curb such abuses and in so doing restore our right to associate free of undue surveillance? The hurdles are gargantuan. The sanction channels for political change in the United States are frighteningly narrow. The technical architecture of the internet, wherein centralized, corporate-controlled servers house most of our data, makes capture both trivially easily and ubiquitous. This technical scenario has been described by civil liberties lawyer Eben Moglen as a recipe for disaster, prompting him and other internet technologists like security expert Bruce Schneier to declare, quote, "We need to figure out how to re-engineer the internet to prevent this kind of wholesale spying." Finally, as the ACLU staff technologist Chris Segoyan argues, so long as internet firms continue to, quote, monetize their users' private data, they can never adopt truly pro-user privacy policies. And yet a field which has seemed hopelessly desolate now resembles a fertile terrain. The politically engaged geek family continues to grow in size and political significance. It is constituted by various organizations and activists working with politicians, lawyers, journalists, and artists. Many emerge from the geeky quarters of the internet. There's Julian Assange, Brigitte Jones-Detor, Chelsea Manning, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Sarah Harrison, Tor developers, Anonymous, Rise Up, Edward Snowden, and many more. The last 2 years have been singular. Never before have so many geeks and hackers wielded their keyboards for the sake of political expression, dissent, and direct action.
That's great.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's a really good lead-in because, you know, as someone who has watched this space and written about it for, you know, almost 20 years now, the last few years have been quite incredible and in a way that's almost impossible to describe because many of us have been really, really concerned about the privacy implications of what was going on and certainly what the government was doing, which we had no idea, the level to which they were doing it. And yet, every time people talked about these things and said we should be worried about these situations, people would say, yeah, we should be worried, but then they would go back to doing exactly what they had done. And yet, since these revelations, we've seen companies actually taking privacy more seriously. I don't know that it's quite reached the level of re-architecting the internet, as Bruce Schneier was saying, but we're starting to see aspects where the people who are responsible are taking it seriously. Have you seen that as well? Or what do you, the part that I do struggle with is how much of that is real and how much of it is just kind of for show in response to this?
I like to think about this current moment where there has been a kind of dramatic upsurge in people caring about privacy and actually doing something to the free speech movement in the United States, where really the apex of that movement came in the 1960s with the Berkeley free speech protests here in the Bay Area, and also key legal cases. But prior to that, there had been these kind of punctuated moments over the course of a century of the century where people were fighting for free speech. And in a similar way, I think with privacy, though geeks and hackers have long cared about it, there's been key legislation in the 1970s in the United States. This feels like this is the first kind of strong grassroots coherent movement that's emerged with substance that can form the basis for change, if not now, at least in the future. And so it is a real difference, and it's hard to say when change will pan out. But prior to this moment, we really only had flickers, and this finally feels like a substantial fire that's burning around the question of privacy.
One thing that's interesting to me, at least, is how much of that change. So there are a few different fronts where the change is happening and where the fights are occurring. And the two key fronts that I see, at least, are one is the legislative front and kind of trying to better protect our privacy and to rein in surveillance. And those efforts, we've seen more progress there than ever. I mean, I guess probably since the 1970s. But still kind of limited. But then at the same time, the other front is just on the technology side, where you have the technologists who are able to encrypt more things, lock things down, take privacy seriously, build the tools that make sure that people's information is kept private, and to get those tools more widely adopted. And on that front, I think we're seeing much more progress. There's still plenty to go, but a significant leap forward. And so what's interesting to me, and I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts on it, is how much is going to change just because enough techies have sort of stood up and say, that was ridiculous, and I'm not going to let that happen next time.
That's exactly it. And, one barometer of that change is I encrypt my mail to someone or receive encrypted mail about 3-4 times a week now, easily. And prior to the Snowden revelations, it was probably 3 times a year. And that's a big shift, and I imagine it's even more so for other people. And geeks and hackers really understand privacy, whether it's, many are system administrators and they have access to everyone's data. So they have a visceral sense, and
Right.
It didn't surprise me when I had heard Edward Snowden had experience being a system administrator. And one of, the big problems is that the sort of base technology for cryptography and encryption is pretty strong, but the usability is very weak. And in some ways, there was always a lot of bitching and moaning about fixing it, but it seems like this moment finally has compelled groups to really start thinking about it. And then there have been a lot of traditional philanthropy organizations, Open Society, Ford Foundation, who are like, hey, maybe we should start investing in this. And that investment, I think, is incredibly important for the kind of grassroots technology realm, as corporations are also moving, hopefully, towards stronger encryptions themselves.
Yeah, it's been interesting, even with the initial attention paid to, the importance of these things, we've seen, I can think of 2 big cases, really in the last year, where sort of the funding aspect of this, came front and center. And the first was the vulnerability in OpenSSL, which suddenly got a lot of attention. And then, very quickly people realized, like, there's one guy who's working on it part-time, and yet it kind of secures, half of the web or whatever. And then suddenly people were like, oh, geez, we have to fund it. And then the other was the one that just happened, a few months ago, or maybe a month ago at this point, which was the GPG, the guy who's working on the thing that most of us use to, if we're doing encrypted email, that most of us rely on. And it was just one guy who was working on it. It was basically, had tried to do a crowdfunding project that nobody funded. And there was an article written about it. And then suddenly, everyone started donating. And, I forget exactly which companies, but a couple companies stepped in,
Right.
and I think maybe a foundation stepped in as well, and basically said, we're going to fund this. And you begin to realize how much of these critical aspects of internet security and privacy have been totally reliant on, individual volunteers. And yet these are the pieces that, when you look at the technologies that have actually stymied the NSA and other surveillance agencies, these are the ones that have been successful, not the big ones from big companies that worked on different technology.
Yeah, there's a couple of things you raise in your commentary now. First of all, there's a lot of real savvy journalists like Julia Angwin
Yep.
who report on this stuff. And again, just like free speech has been reported on by journalists for an entire century, again, we're seeing now a critical mass around these issues with really smart journalists who are able to also, translate the kind of technical issues. The second thing is, historically, infrastructure has not been sexy to fund. And I've known a lot of independent hacker projects, with the exception of Tor, which was always kind of government funded from the beginning, really struggle to get funding in the past. Now, all of a sudden, it's very clear that infrastructure is necessary, and there is a kind of sexiness to it because it's part of these kind of dramatic stories. And then the last thing you mention is, it is great if, let's just say, Apple moves to really include strong encryption, but in the end, we always need non-corporate tools as well. Just because corporations are often cornered because they have, certain relationships with the government,
Sure.
even when they're, doing the best possible thing. And this is not to demonize them, but just a kind of reminder that it's really important that we continue to fund the kind of grassroots technology movement who have historically provided us with those tools and who I think can, finish off the job if properly funded.
Yeah, I mean, even the case of one of the other revelations, which I actually don't think was a Snowden revelation, was the RSA basically agreeing to effectively backdoor a key technology and then declaring that the default for one of their things, which, people trusted RSA. I mean, they were the big player, and I don't know how much that is, the reputation hit that the company took has really impacted their bottom line. I have no idea necessarily, but it certainly makes it clear that even when you think you can trust certain companies, most people can't quite tell. I mean, there have been rumors and people had sort of known about some of the RSA stuff, but having at least third-party alternatives that are also open and audited, really is important. And it's interesting to see also beyond just even the supporting the hacking of these tools. We're starting to see people supporting, running audits, security audits on the different technologies. Like, there was the whole, the TrueCrypt, right? Where they were doing an audit, and then that sort of turned into a little bit of a mess also. But it's interesting, and I think really good to see a lot more people paying attention to these issues. And I think it is, there's a combination of factors there, and certainly, just having more attention paid to these issues, having, good journalists like Julia cover them and others as well, and, actually leading to it. What do you think, it's sort of a general question, but, what do you think is necessary as sort of a next step? Because even as, maybe, you and I will use encrypted email some of the time. My parents still aren't going to do it. And, lots of people aren't going to do it. But, what is it going to take to get to that next level?
Well, first, I'm not convinced that we need society-wide encryption.
Sure.
I do think we need basically all journalists and lawyers and activists to be using it to the extent that, you wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. Like these populations should all be using it as default. And that would be a huge win. That would be a huge win because they're the ones who, if they're being surveilled, it's particularly potent. And there's actually large numbers of journalists and lawyers in these countries, right?
Yeah.
And so that's in some ways a huge first step. And then from there, we can kind of start thinking beyond that at some level. And it is tough because despite the fact that, there's huge numbers of geeks and hackers in the world, and I think that's quite interesting because they're very, dogged in their thinking, very anti-authoritarian. I think, the whole reason why we have leaks today and these sorts of projects is they've managed to retain forms of independence while they're very kind of privileged actors working for the corporate sector or the government, right? Mm-hmm. But this idea that, digital natives exist and they're like really savvy with technology is not the case. And I'm always amazed in my classes where I ask people if they know what source code is, if they know what a server is, if they know what a system administrator is. And they look at me like very blankly going, wasn't that a movie, Source Code, I think. And so there is a lot of digital literacy that has to happen first. And I think it's so important because, as everything interfaces with computers, and journalism interfaces with programming, as there's this widespread surveillance, young people have to at least know about the issues. And I don't understand why we don't have like an internet class in high school, you know what I mean? Which would be so fun and they would dig it. And it's so vital.
Yeah. I mean, we had an earlier podcast where we actually were talking about like different, sort of that question about, what people should learn in high school. And it's tricky though, right? Because it's easy to say there should be like like an internet 101, but what do you include in that class, right? But I agree to some extent, but I kind of wonder.
Or you can make it part of there's what's it called, social history in high school. The kind of
social studies.
Social studies.
Yes.
So one, just like you do many parts of the world,
right? Like
one semester or half a semester can be internet studies, and there's really interesting readings that are short that get at these issues, right?
Start with a week.
Exactly.
Yeah.
2 weeks. 2 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, so back on Mike's question though, like, is this something that more of society should be concerned with? I mean, you said before that lawyers and certain activists should definitely be encrypting their email, but taking it from the other side, which is if it were essentially just something that everyone did, it wouldn't necessarily feel as weird, right?
Yeah, and there is, today on Twitter, something flew by my screen, and I was like, oh, that was really smart, and it was something like, someone said, I'm more worried about parents who use surveillance technologies on their kids because then they get like habituated to it, thinking that's okay. And I am very concerned about people who know that they're being surveilled because I do think it changes how you act and think in the world.
Absolutely.
And given, that's a reality. And then I do think more kids know more than ever the implications. They may not think about it very deeply, but they know kind of that Facebook collects this data and there's this thing going on with the government. And then they might kind of shift practices. And it's true that, having the encryption technology out there and trying to kind of create places where they adopt them is one of the pedagogical ways to go, maybe this is not okay, right? Because how to signal that message in the context of ubiquitous parental, governmental, and corporate surveillance is important.
Yeah, there's this sort of interesting thing, like, some people have this impression or belief that kids today don't care about privacy. Like that sort of that concept has gone around. And, somebody pointed out to me recently, or I was at a conference and I heard them speak and they said, that's not true. It's just that the threat model for kids is different. Rather than the government that they're afraid of their parents joining Facebook and seeing what they do. And that's why things like Snapchat and Yik Yak and things like that suddenly became very popular. And then people are jumping on those things, and now they're suddenly discovering also that just because Snapchat says they're going to, delete your messages, that doesn't really mean it. And so they're getting this very real lesson in privacy, and that hopefully they'll understand these issues at a deeper level,
Right.
Later on.
But I think the fact that they're growing up thinking about these types of issues, like I equate it to, like, I couldn't ever think about driving around in a car without a seatbelt, right? But generations
Right.
before, that was something that you did. And right now, just thinking about it gives me chills. And I think that kids today that are growing up, like, they don't realize they're thinking about Snapchat in a privacy kind of way. But when they grow up and they start communicating, it'll be something that is natural to them. And
Right.
I think that's the kind of generational shift that perhaps it's going to take, right?
Right, and that's, the kind of crossroads, because you're completely right. Dana Boyd's work, It's Complicated, shows that they care about privacy, but right under the right conditions, that will be hammered out of them, if there is no alternative. And so this is where I guess maybe the corporate players really do have a role, insofar as if they make easy to use kind of encryption that really, and they do so with integrity,
Right.
can really be a force for good, because they're the ones reaching everyone, right?
Yeah.
Tor and PGP, you're like, high school student is probably not going to use it, right?
Yeah, that seems unlikely.
Yeah, except for those that read Cory Doctorow,
Right,
Little Brother, right?
the extreme ones. I'm sure
Yeah.
there will be some. Like I'm sure the way we all were in high school.
Yeah, I was all over encryption in high school.
But going back even to your book, I mean, how much of a role do you actually think that sort of the hacktivist community and Anonymous and folks like that, how much of a role do you think they play in that world as well, in terms of making more people aware of these things, getting them to recognize the importance, because there's one thing to just sort of be lashing out and attacking and to or to stage protests in one way, right? And Anonymous has shown the ability to do those things, but could you sort of turn their power towards I don't know if it's quite an education campaign, but convincing people that these things are important in a different way?
Geeks and hackers of very different sorts, I think, are absolutely the central actors, and in very different ways. And what I do find interesting about Anonymous is, look at the name, look at the iconography, like it symbolically embodies those very values.
Yeah.
And that's really important and fascinating, because I think also for some people, privacy is a little harder to kind of pin down as to what it is and why it matters. And for Anonymous, it's really this living ethic where they're committed to it because they know the kind of implications for loss of democracy. But they're also really into they're very in tune with the fact that we live in a day and age where there's so much pressure to kind of bear the self and, get recognition for the individual. And that has implications for a kind of self-surveillance as well. And they're all about like, no, mute the self, do it for the power of the group. And it's, I think, so key to have spaces like this that exist. And it's one reason why a lot of geeks who are not particularly technical, because you don't need to participate in Anonymous, were attracted to it. Now, of course, this kind of expressive domain can only go so far. But, the crypto party, which was an idea hatched by Asher Wolf. She's a really talented journalist, and she was a friend of Anonymous. It was brilliant. It was really, really brilliant. And they, don't necessarily attract hundreds of people, but they usually attract 50 to 60 people. There's one going on today in Oakland in the Omni Commons. And it's a really kind of good model to reach, both the kind of professionals like journalists, but also some members of the public as well. And what nourished that were all the geeks and hackers who've been kind of beating this drum for, a decade or two.
Even Snowden took part in a crypto party before.
He did. I mean, I just love that. You know what I mean? That was excellent. And they do suffer a little bit from like, how do you go beyond again a kind of geeky, self-inclined population to go? But I do know, for example, and I do this, like I'm going to have my my class do a crypto training,
Yeah.
and the educational context really matter, and more academics are using this stuff, and then we are in a perfect position to host events in the universities and reach a much wider swath of people as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's really exciting, and for people who haven't sort of embraced the just at least learning about it and testing out the kind of encryption. There's something kind of fun about it once you actually get it set up. And my favorite thing is actually when I send an encrypted email where the entire message is something like "okay," I'm like, I encrypted that, and the NSA is going to keep that for like 20 years. And if they crack it, like, okay, but like I just the fact that I've done that is kind of interesting. I know we're running out of time, but do you have any sort of final thoughts or messages that you want people listening to this to think about in terms of where these things are going, what they should be doing?
Yeah, maybe going back to the opening, which is about a pessimism that has some room for optimism. The history of free software, I think, can actually teach us why we should maybe be hopeful. When Richard Stallman came up with the idea of free software in 1984, he started to develop tools, and then there was, some legal regimes that were developed. But for the first 15 years of free software, it was marginal. It was esoteric, and yes, geeks were loving their GCC and Emacs and their tools, right? But it was really treated like a madman's dream. And then, Linus comes around, creates a different style of development with a Linux project, and boom, it takes off. And this is just a reminder that as we're working towards something, if there's not like massive yields and dividends, the first couple of years, that doesn't mean it's lost. So I think the important thing is to continue doing it. Like if it goes away, that's really a problem.
Right.
But we're in a good position where, again, there's some critical mass, and I do suspect there will be some yields so long as there's ongoing funding for these projects. We may not see it for another 5-7 years, but in the grand scheme of things, that's actually a pretty short period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's amazing about these things is exactly the way you described, where it's like all these different pieces are developed and they don't necessarily catch on, but they sort of build on top of each other. And it's going back to the things that we discussed before, where it is kind of ongoing experimentation as well, and something will click and suddenly take off. And it's important to keep that experimentation going to figure out what it is that really clicks.
Exactly. Just stay outraged.
Exactly.
And have fun developing.
Yeah. I don't think either of those things should be that difficult.
Yeah.
But once again, thank you for joining us. And for listeners, again, if you haven't read the book, please go out and get it. Check it out. It's really a very interesting read. And thanks again.
It was my pleasure.
I'm watching you, watching me, watching you, watching me. And between us there's a lot to see. We'd probably rather not